Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're going to have a fantastic and incredible episode, just like always. And today, all of our topics are going to be coming from Cotton Elite questions. And so we are going to jump right into that. And the first question we have, and this is going to be a long topic. I think we're going to be dedicating about 30 minutes to this. It comes from Jack, and he asks, Scott, what is your take on the fraternity involvement in the campus protests that happened last week? So this has set off a fiery debate on Twitter about what position should we take on these guys, what to make of them. A lot of conservatives have been enthralled. I thought these guys are awesome. At Ole Miss, I thought they were awesome, but we're going to go into that why. But there's also been counter takes saying these guys are terrible because they're protesting for Israel. So we're going to go into this and discuss what the protests are like. We talked about the protests last week, but now we've got new elements coming into the protests. So we will go over to that. And I think first to begin, we've got to talk about the initial campus protests and the pro-Palestinian protests. And so these have been breaking out all over the country. And the thing to realize is that the national mood is turning against Israel, and it's particularly the war. Polls show that a majority of Americans now oppose Israel's actions in the war. I mean, Gallup had a poll showing in November a slight majority of Americans supported Israel's actions. Now it was like 54% or something. Now, or the latest polls like March, it's 55%, probably a little bit higher now. And most polls are showing a souring attitude both not just to the war, but to Israel itself. At the same time, public opinion of the campus protests is negative. And this sometimes happens. I mean, not all protests are a positive way to push your advance your point of view. There's a lot of examples where the public, when you demonstrate in public, the public then turns against whatever public view you're saying. You can even look at something like Charlottesville, where some of that is not Charlottesville's fault. I mean, there's other things involved there, but the fact that the media said all these neo-Nazis or whatever are, and they were able to conjure up that image of the people protesting there, the mostly peaceful protesters, they were able to advocate for demolishing more Confederate statues and then pushing for free speech restrictions on social media and censorship. It was pretty much accomplished the opposite of what they wanted to accomplish. And even you can see this with, and most people understand that there's an importance to optics and what you're protesting and smart tactics with protesting in order to advocate your view. We care a lot about the Great Replacement and immigration and all that. Now, when a group, like an idiotic group like the Blood Tribe or any of these groups go out there and have like swastikas and all this nonsense out there, and they're talking about Great Replacement, pretty much everyone cringes and like, that's not the best way to advocate for it. I'm not saying that the pro-Palestinians campus protesters go that far, but they are having a viewpoint, and I'm not sure, and it's unclear if there is a tie between disapproval of them with declining support or with support for Israel. I think it's actually happening at the same time that the American people are turning against the war at the same time they don't like the protesters. Polls show this, that they're having displeasure. It's nearly half say they oppose the protests, and then only under 30%, I think it's like 28%, support them, and the rest it's unsure. There's another poll that said that 47% have the erroneous view that campus should ban the protests. It's not just saying do you support or oppose, but they're like, 47% say that campus should ban them, which as I've always said, I thought that the interactions of the police have been overkill. I think these Republican lawmakers who are thinking that pogroms are happening on campus, that they need to send like the Marines there, it's ridiculous. It doesn't matter if they're breaking the rules. They're just having a campsite. Kids do this stupid shit all the time. And school's about to end anyway, so the encampments are probably going to end if you care about them following the rules. So there's no need to send the riot squads out there to a lot of these places. And there's no need for much of this. And a lot of the violence that they claim is emanating from the Palestinian demonstrators is just fake news. it's not there, and they have to just say like, "Oh, can you believe this? I saw a sign saying we don't like Israel," and then they act like that's a call for the Marines. And this is building up support for the ridiculous anti-Semitism bill in Congress, which we'll talk about for the next topic in this episode. But not, for now, we're going to focus on the protests. So that's the public views of this. Now, why are they so hostile to the protesters? And I think for conservatives, they've always never liked the protesters, the Palestinian protesters. American public, it's a little bit different. But here with the campus protests, it's not just conservatives, it's the American public itself. Now, conservatives have always hated them because they look at them and they see them as the enemy, as the opposite side. There's always been very few normal white people involved in these protests. Now, the ones outside of the campus have had, I guess, normal Muslims, what you would say. I mean, there's been guys there that probably run their own business. They don't have blue hair. They just, they don't like Israel's actions. And they're out there protesting. And so it's fairly normal people. But a lot of the other people who are there are not quite the people that conservatives would support. There's always been Antifa types there. There's always been, blue-haired women, and it's all been very non-white. There's not been a lot of normal white people there, and I think that's just the fact that even though I'm not saying that like all white people, I don't think all white people support Israel. I think it's just not an important issue to them. So there's a number, and you can see this in polls. And polls show that there is declining support for Israel, particularly among young people. But I think that they just don't care about it enough to protest. and even when you look at voter polls on when they prioritize issues, Israel, the conflict is generally at the bottom of the list of issues. Economy, immigration, inflation, those are what at the top. And Israel, Ukraine are like at the bottom. And so people just don't care enough to protest. But they may have different views. So the people who are most likely to protest or Muslims are from, that would you'd say like non-Antifa types are just Muslims, regular ordinary Muslims in America. And then Antifa types. That's the only ones who are going to be general protests. But I think with a lot of the other protests, especially what was going on in Michigan and elsewhere, they were able to show that this is like, hey, we are an important voter demographic to Democrats. We're really pissed off about this issue. They cast their ballots for non-committed against Biden in Michigan and a few other places to signal their disapproval of how Biden's handling the war. And that is a strong protest move against Americans' involvement. And Biden himself, due to that displeasure he's seeing from Muslims and a lot of his base definitely cares about it, especially people who work professionally in democratic and liberal politics are overwhelmingly pro-Palestine, while it's more the older crowd and the donors who are more pro-Israel, even though he has a lot of big donors who are now taking a harder stance against Israel. And there's been funding for some of these protesters, which everyone's like, oh, this is a deep state op. I mean, all these left-wing groups get money from people like Soros and elsewhere. And that money just goes to these various protests. I don't know if they're necessarily approving of it, but there are organizations they give money to then help out these groups. But there has been donors who've been telling Biden, you've got to take a stronger stance against Israel in this conflict. And there's been a lot of donors who at the same time have said the opposite, and they're now considering voting for Trump or RFK, like Bill Ackman and these guys. So there's a little bit of a divide there. But among the younger crowd, they deeply care about this issue, and they're really pissed, and they're yelling at their Congress members and others that they work for that something should be done. So he's feeling a lot of pressure on that. And that pressure is making him do stuff that a lot of past U.S. presidents wouldn't do. I mean, they just announced that they're going to be restricting ammunition sales to Israel in order to halt the advance of where Israel goes into Gaza. I don't know if that'll work or if that'll be enough, but I mean, it is something. And Biden is desperate to end this war or have some type of conclusion to this war before the election, because he knows that the war is continuing to go on. By November, Muslim voters and some other elements of the Democratic base is going to punish him. So that aside is that there have been, I think, the Muslims voicing their displeasure at how Biden's handling the war has sent a message. It's been effective demonstration against him. And to go back to, so I'll compare that to campus protests, but go back to the conservative opinions. There's not much, a lot of conservative leaning people aren't going to like these protests. I mean, there's no American flags there. There's not a lot of patriotism. Some in the crowd, shout death to America and rip up flags and do all that type of stuff. So they're not going to be won over to this. And then they look at these people and they're like, there's no one like me there. There's no normal white people. It's all Muslims are Antifa. I'm not going to, even though they might be like, I don't really like how much money we're spending on Israel. I don't really support this war effort. But when I see these protesters, I really don't like them. And this is definitely heightened with the campus protesters, because the campus protesters, the kind of normie Muslims who are just walking around with their Palestinian flag and saying "end the war," they aren't there. It's really just all the lefty types on campus. It's all the campus leftists, and even some of the Antifa types coming off campus. Like they arrested some wealthy, some anarchist leader guy at the Columbia protest, and they've arrested a number of these people. And if you look at the mugshots, there are no like normie white people, normal looking white people among these protests. And so now they really, really don't like them when they see these protesters. And I don't think they give a shit about them like occupying buildings. I know that like a lot of these Jewish commentators and very pro-Israel commentators are like, I can't believe they're taking over this building. And they're like, their campsites are an act of aggression. This is the most anti-Semitic thing I've ever seen. And they always say this stuff. And I guess they really care about that. But most conservatives don't. And they just really, when they see police arresting them and anything, it has, for most of the average conservative viewer, not commentator, average conservative person, they just see this as my enemy getting his ass beat. And that's all they care about. So they don't even care about the cause. They just say that. Now you could say that's right or wrong, that they should actually care about this. And I think they should definitely oppose police action against this, because one, this is infringing on the First Amendment rights. These kids aren't, even if you think they're stupid, they're not violent. They're not, for most part, they're not causing really any damage. The only place I really saw where they had a full-on element to like battle police, but even they weren't very effective at battling police, was Portland State. But Portland is just another matter. I guess a little bit in Columbia they occupied a building, but even there they kind of just surrounded the building and kind of forced them to leave. I don't know. It's or trying to shoo them out. But any case, I've always said the police, really what happened at UT Austin and some of these Southern California universities has been outrageous. I think it was USC where they sent in cops to beat them up. I mean, there's no need to do that. We need to respect free speech, and having some of these governors, like the guy in Oklahoma saying this is hate speech, we have to do something. And same with Greg Abbott, this is hate speech. We can't allow anti-Semitism to be allowed in these places. Obviously, we want conservatives to oppose that because we're pro-free speech. We don't want them to. We should especially not want anyone to be cracking down on hate speech, because we would obviously be the number one targets. So even if you think these guys are goofy and stupid, conservatives should be careful and should not be cheerleading on the police state going after these guys on hate speech grounds. And so that's always like that. Now, when it comes to people wanting to take counter protests against them, that's a little bit of a different matter. We are pro-free speech, so people can knock themselves out. Most campuses, it's just been all like Hillel chapter and the Jewish fraternities that have been protesting, and they all have Israeli flags. I guess they have more American flags than the Palestinians, but they're still, it's still overwhelmingly another foreign country's flag. And another thing that makes conservatives hate them is that a lot of these protesters are, lowering the American flag and putting up the Palestinian flag. They're putting the keffiyeh on George Washington and all these other figures. The people aren't just going to like that. It's obviously bad optics that's going to enrage a lot of middle Americans and conservatives. So they're going to support anyone who's against them. So that's been in the case. But at a few Southern universities, there's been people who have decided to take a more patriotic and pro-American stance rather than getting involved in the Israel-Palestine conflict. And that's where the fraternities have come in. And so this has become controversial over whether they're fighting for Israel or not. I think the main thing, and I made this in a tweet, is that this is primarily a protest against campus leftists and hostility towards them, not really anything about the Israel-Gaza war. Now, the example that everyone is highlighting is that this became famous at UNC because a bunch of frat guys went up and stopped the flag from being lowered, and they were getting shouted at and verbally abused by the whole crowd. And a lot of people were pro these guys because they look they look more put together than their opponents. These guys look like people that conservatives would want to support rather than the protesters, and they're protecting the flag and being patriotic and singing the national anthem and other things. But now outside of that circle protecting the American flag were a couple Jewish members from the Jewish fraternity AE Pi. And these guys were not protecting the flag. They were just waving an Israel flag. They were not part of that group protecting the flag. They were doing shit. They were doing their own little cause. The guys protecting the flag were not AE Pi's. They were primarily from Pi Kappa Phi and other non-Jewish fraternities, the normal fraternities. But outside of it was AE Pi. Fox News, in a poor decision, decided to invite one of the flag defenders on, which was one of the AE Pi members who was not protecting the flag. He was waving the Israeli flag. And this guy went up there and was like, oh, it's all about Israel. It's all about defending Israel. The problem is that was not the motivation of the guys protecting the flag, because two of them who made public statements all insisted this had nothing to do with Israel-Palestinian conflict. They themselves were not Jewish, and that they were just saying we were there to protect the flag. That's it. And it's hard to sell to American people that they shouldn't have protected the flag. You may think that's wrong or right, whatever. It's very hard to sell people that they should not side with people protecting the flag. I mean, conservatives and most of the people we have on our side are patriotic. They don't really like seeing the American flag replaced with a foreign flag. And I think that's why they came to support these guys at UNC. So you had that incident, but there's two separate things. Is that there was a Fox News interview, and a lot of Fox News has been trying to say, oh, this is about protecting Israel, because they've been shrieking about campus anti-Semitism for months, and this is like the worst thing ever. So they love to twist the facts into making this into entirely about Israel, when a lot of the motivations of these students has little to do with the war. At least in the three cases where fraternities were involved. Now, there was another before this. There was a case at Arizona State where alleged frat guys were tearing down pro-Palestinian signs and elsewhere, and police were allowing them to do that. Now, it's been rumored that those guys are from the Hillel chapter there, or that they do have the Jewish fraternities at ASU, both AE Pi and ZBT. So they may have been from either of those organizations, and that's something separate. But the three examples at the Southern universities, it was overwhelmingly the normal Gentile fraternities that were involved in this, and it was simply a patriotic pro-Trump protest against their campus leftists. And this is particularly true at Ole Miss, where there were no Israeli flags. It was all Americana and Trump flags. There are no Jewish fraternities at Ole Miss. There's hardly any Jews at Ole Miss itself. And these guys began, and it was like the entire chapters were offloading their members to shout at them, because there's like hundreds of guys there. I mean, I don't know, maybe not 1,000, but there was a lot of people there. Could have been even 1,000. So it was like all of Greek life went around to surround these guys and yell at them and sing the national anthem and all that. And this is where the real controversy came from. We'll go, actually, because Ole Miss is the primary one, I'll also bring up LSU. LSU happened on Friday, also predominantly fraternity, patriotic, national anthem, that type of stuff. But there were like two students, I think two girls, who came up, who seemed not a part of the crowd, and they had an Israeli flag. I don't know if they looked like sorority girls. They weren't part of the they weren't frat guys, and they seemed to be just probably from the local Hillel chapter that joined it. Now you could say like, well, that's problematic that they have an Israeli flag there or whatever. But the motivation of the majority of that crowd was just about, we want to chastise these campus leftists who are interrupting our university life. The general public doesn't like the protesters, regardless of what their viewpoints are. And I can even remember this when I was in college. The Occupy Wall Street was happening. And all of Greek life hated the Occupy Wall Street people, not for anything to their issues. It's just because they were seen as the campus weirdos and leftists who were like, breaking, messing with campus life. And they just were the most visible element of leftism that they would see in front of them. And so a lot of people were like extremely hostile to them. I remember it going out to New Year's Eve years ago. I guess this was like 2011, and some guys from another fraternity were like fighting these guys. So there was all that that was happening at that time. So people, they like that whole life hated Occupy Wall Street. And it's viewed the same ways as Palestinians, because they're right in front of them. If they're trying to go to class, they have these people there. They see them. They're clearly very different from Greek life. At Ole Miss, I don't think there was a single white person among them. They had the Lizzo woman, and there was another image of a brown woman. I guess she's some type of Arab or Muslim, who is looking like, downcast, and it's like a photo, and she's looking downcast in the background. There's all these frat guys flicking her off and yelling at her, and they're all waving the American flag. So quite the image you have there. And so it's just seen as these are the campus weirdos and leftists, and they don't like them, and they see them as hostile to the lifestyle that they want and the culture that they want. So it has. I think especially at Ole Miss there was no, even though the pro-Palestinians were definitely thinking about the war, I think the counter-protesters had very little to do with the war. It was just a way to jeer at people they don't like. And Ole Miss became the most controversial because of the racism accusations. There was one guy who is allegedly made monkey noises at this fat black woman that they were all calling Lizzo when she came out in the crowd to flick them off and scream at him. It's hard, you can argue that he was just whooping along with the crowd, because when he's just like there, they're all like whooping and making noises at her, and they're just like, this guy's making monkey noises, you can't do that. And he's been expelled from his fraternity because nationals, I have to make this clear, it's not the local chapters, it's like nationals making these decisions, and nationals is generally more cucked than locals. Nationals, anytime there's a controversial measure, they kick these guys out. There's no, they don't try to defend these guys, because it's like, for them, they just view this as a business, and they want to make the most inclusive message possible. Local chapters operate very differently. That they are not prioritizing diversity. They're still, wanting a particular type of person to join, not and excluding a lot of people. They are not embracing progressive and liberal values in their chapter. I mean, this is why people join fraternities, is because the rest of the campus is full of leftism and lots of ugly people and weird ass shit. And then fraternities and sororities are very different and are very white. And I mean, I don't know if you want to say completely conservative values, but compared to the rest of campus, yes, you would say more conservative values. I don't know if it'd be not on certain questions, but I think in generally what they prefer, the norms that they prefer. And this is like the only part of campus that's going to be proudly training for Trump, which is what these Ole Miss kids were doing. And it is nice to see that on a college campus where I've never really seen that before. It's only, all this stuff has only come from Greek life on a college campus. So this kid who is a member of Phi Delta Theta is getting punished for this. He's been expelled by a national chapter. The old University of Mississippi is now investigating him to see, what wrong he did by hooting at this woman or whatever. And this has become, this has been seen as like the new form of racism emerging on campus. Obviously, that's stupid. It's not like that. He should It's like, what do you expect college students to act like when they're in a vigorous protest against each other? So the kid deserves to be defended, especially, I mean, he didn't do anything really wrong here. And none of these kids did. And all these people were celebrating it. You know, you had tons of conservative commentators and the governor of Mississippi and all these people embracing these guys when they did this. And I think it's, if for average conservatives, they're obviously going to side with these guys because they're like normal looking white people. They're patriotic. They're embracing America. While the other side, there's no American flags. They're weird looking. They're very diverse. There's no normal white people among them, and just by instinct, they're going to side with the other side. And a lot of this is based on like tribalism. It's like, it's very hard to convince conservatives to be on the side of the Palestinian protesters when they see them and they're like, these people are clearly look nothing like me, and on every issue they're opposed to me. I may question how much we're spending on Israel. I don't like the war, but I'm going to side with my own people against the other side. Friend enemy distinction. And if you look at this, pretty much every right winger is going to side with the fraternity guys over the protesters, regardless of the issue. But a lot of our guys don't. Fraternities, I mean, it's some of it's like deep ideological reasons. It's like, look, they, really want to stress the importance of the Israeli war, and they want it to end, and they're thus going to side with the protesters, even though they may see them as filthy leftists. They're like, look, at least they're supporting a good cause that I back, and anyone who's opposed against them is bad. And there's like that. There's I guess a principled stance against them. I would say that's wrong here based on the fraternities. I think it's very different at other campuses. I mean, the most ridiculous example is there's been far more attention paid to this one kid from Ole Miss who allegedly made monkey noises and just hooping and hollering, compared to the like 50 or so Israeli Jews who invaded UCLA's campus and began beating the shit out of the protesters. I mean, they would like violently assaulting them. It wasn't just shoving. I mean, they were carrying like planks, hitting them over the head, and like punching and kicking. And they really bloodied these guys that they were attacking. I mean, these were full on assaults that was happening. Hardly any attention. Now, a couple differences. One, a lot of the Zionists and others who are really intense on focusing on the protesters know that these are their people, because a lot of these guys, I mean, people allege that they're IDF members. I mean, they were like, big guys that were there. They did look like veterans of something. And they allegedly came from the Israeli Jewish community of LA to go over there and beat these guys up. And they're a little bit, I guess, more working class, you would say. They see those as their guys, and they're also going to turn the other side because, they're attacking the demonstrators fully on, and they're just like, well, that's it. But the funny thing is that even the Jewish groups at UCLA that have been warning, it's like, oh, we're getting attacked. This is so violent. They realize how bad optics it is to just have these guys beat the shit out of them that they had to beg them not to return to campus. I don't know if they'll have that, but they didn't want to draw much attention to it, likely because they're more to sympathize with these guys. They're their people. And also, none of the people they were beating up looked like Lizzo. Were strong black women. I mean, it looked like a lot of them they seem to be attacking more the white leftists involved, some of the Muslims who were involved in the campus. They weren't attacking any blacks, which if they had attacked a black person, then that probably would have been a different story. Ole Miss, the target was a black woman who looked like Lizzo, so obviously media's going to side with her. They love Lizzo. They love Stacey Abrams and all these other types. So immediately, if anyone's insulting her, they're going to defend. And here it's a white Gentile frat boy who makes for an easy target. And also that they view this as not something over Israel or Palestine, which and I think that's a acknowledgement by the media and even some of the really pro-Israel conservatives, that they understood that this was not about Israel and Palestine. Because if these kids were from the Hillel chapter and were waving an Israeli flag and doing this, there'd be a lot more defense of this guy. But the fact is that they were waving the American flag, and just standard white Southerners, they don't want to defend him. and they're just like, whatever. You're distracting from our cause, you should say. So I think even the fact that they don't really want to defend this guy and the other fraternities, and they're starting to, think that they went a little bit overboard while defending the thugs at UCLA. It's an indication that they feel that they're distracting from the core issue, which they want to emphasize, and what those AEPI members at UNC said. And it's like, this is all about Israel, but the fraternity guys, I think it's about something else. It's about that they don't like the campus leftists, and they don't like disrespect towards the American flag, and that's their main issues. And as the fraternity guys who actually defended the flag, they said this has nothing to do with Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's just about patriotism. And for the Ole Miss guys, is clearly anti-campus leftists. So there's that principled stance, which I think is misguided with talking about the fraternity guys. I think I'll go a little bit into that moment and explain more why it's misguided. There's also always going to be an element within our sphere that's anti-Greek life. I made this point on Twitter. Well, we have a number of guys who are more like Nicholas Cruz, the Parkland shooter, than anyone in fraternities. Some people are like, oh, of course we've got dorks and nerds. And yeah, obviously, if you're really online, you're likely not a normie. I've always kind of argued this. There's this dichotomy of normie versus like school shooter on online, where people try to take both opposing poles. They try to go really hard into pretending they're a normie, and a lot of these guys are not normies, and they go really over the top. There's like this concept that's one anon is invented called Swiftie normality, where he's demanding anons like worship Taylor Swift and Caitlin Clark to own the left or something. And it's like, you don't need to be a basic bitch to do that. That like, people are just not normies if you're online, okay? And if you're really into politics, you're probably not that much of a normie. But if you're into far right politics, you're definitely not a normie. Now that doesn't mean you have to go full on misfit school shooter. I think there's a balance. There's a recognition that you're not fully like normie, because I mean the normies or NPCs might be a better way to say this, or they're just focused on daily life's pleasures. They're they're sports betting, they're focused on their job. They don't really think about these larger issues. And they're definitely not spending a lot of time on Twitter discussing intricate political topics and philosophy and history. That's not their interest. Now, that's not me saying that everyone who's online is total freak and like completely outlandish to normies. They just have different interests than normies, and they think differently. They're not total NPCs. I mean, that's why they came to radical right-wing politics. But there is a full-on, you go into the other side where you fully embrace the school shooter mentality, where you're just like anti-normie, everything is bad, and you kind of have this very malcontent outlook on life. And sometimes people indulge that a little bit too much and go too farther, and it's all about how much they can offend normies or be hostile to normie interests. And some people go full on into that, and that's always something you have to worry about in our sphere. But there's a lot of people who are naturally like that in our sphere, because I mean, for a lot of people who are into far right politics, something is wrong in their life. I always bring up this point, or I like this quote from Jeff Hanneman of Slayer, the band Slayer, if you're not familiar, who gave an interview. Jeff Hanneman's been dead for over 10 years, but he gave an interview back in the 80s when he was like talking about Slayer's music, and he's like saying, if you're really into our music, there's something wrong in your life. And I always say that that's also sort of true for the right. I don't think everyone's like, there's something wrong with their life. I mean, it's not like saying everyone's just like a broke loser or something, but I think there's like something that's gone amiss, or you feel that there's something gone amiss in either your life or in the world around you, and that's why you turn to it. And some people, there's a lot going wrong in their life, and they kind of go online to vent about this. And they're obviously going to hate Greek life, because that's a completely different lifestyle from them. That's something that they are never going to be part of, and they have deep grievances against it. Some people didn't want to join Greek life because, they didn't like the partying and that type of stuff, and maybe it was against some of their values. I can understand, but there's a lot of them who are more like Nicholas Cruz and would have never been allowed into a fraternity house to begin with. And so you have those types. And so you have to not allow those types to fully dominate the discourse. I always see this. I mean, one time when I defended sororities, as somebody was making an anti-white attack on them, and it was like saying, I can't believe all these white people are there, and I just simply defended them on the basis of them being white. And for a whole week, I had people melting down in my mentions about how dare I defend sororities. And I was like, this is a little out of control for people to get this mad about about these women. And it's like, do you know what the women like are outside of sororities? They're just as bad, if they're likely worse, especially on campuses. You don't have to, that might not be your type or whatever, but like, people had full on meltdowns. Like, I just ran over their dog. And I think it's kind of that Nicholas Cruz mindset that a few number of them have. I don't think that's not the majority. It is a minority, but they sometimes come out and are noticeable in this stuff. And I guess it's some of the stuff they say is so outlandish compared to what you would see in your day-to-day life that they cause more notice. And some people have to be aware of them, but it is just a funny dynamic. And there's always a balance between NPC, normie versus full-on misfit that people have to balance out and not try to fall into either categories. I don't think they have to really worry about being a full-on normie PC. That's almost like LARPing for them to do this. But for a lot of people, it wouldn't be a LARP if they went in the other direction. So you just always have to avoid that mindset when you get there. I mean, this is politics, and in order to politics, you have to win over a lot of people. And if everyone views you as freaks and total outsiders, and no matter what your message is, they're not going to want to be near you. A lot of politics is based on vibes and social status and how they perceive people. And if you guys present yourself as, school shooter mindset, you're only going to get more malcontents and the losers of society who are not going to really make a major impact. And so that's just something you always have to consider with this stuff. So that aside, I think when it is misguided criticism of fraternities, there's a lot of other protests you can be focusing in on. I think if people want to complain about the backlash against these protests or criticize them, you can look at what the police are doing, and you can look at what these guys in UCLA are doing, and there's a lot of other examples to get mad about. The fraternity guys weren't even really, they weren't attacking them. They weren't, the vast majority of them weren't waving the Israeli flag. There was like 2 or 3 guys at UNC and 2 people at LSU, tiny minority among them, and nobody doing that at Ole Miss. These are the few expressions of campus right-wing, campus conservative stuff you see. It's very rare for you to see a bunch of kids look normal white kids, go up, chant "We want Trump," sing the national anthem, and wave the American flag. And I think for anyone who's an American right-winger, you're going to like that, regardless of whatever the opposing side's cause is. And I think you could still be supportive of those guys while being critical of Israel and being critical of the war and wanting change in relationship and the way America interacts with Israel, while still being supportive of those guys, because we have very few examples of this type of stuff happening on campus where an overwhelming majority of these guys turn out in favor of Trump, favor of America, and against campus leftists. Now, you could say it's like it would be better if they were focused on illegal immigration or BLM, but this is what's right before them. When at the height of BLM, campuses were closed down. They were remote learning. There wasn't much for anyone to do. And I don't know, illegal immigration, they're not really plopping illegal immigrants on campuses. This is just what's the expression of leftism they see, in the same way that back in my day, fraternities reacted very negatively towards Occupy Wall Street. And now they react very negatively to these guys because these people are disrupting, campus life. They find them annoying. They don't like them. They look at them. They're like, these guys are ugly, whatever. They're outside. They're completely different from my sphere. And in a tribalistic mindset, I view them as the enemy. And so I want to jeer at them and sing the national anthem at them. And that's the sole motivation of them. And so why I can understand if you're pro-Palestinian protesters because, you share the same cause. I made this point last week. I mean, there's no right-wing involvement in these Palestinian protests. Now, in some ways, it might be better for them because, if Blood Tribe showed up, I always love Blood Tribe and Goyim Defense League, that would definitely undermine them. There's other groups that could show up, but if you're talking about most likely to show up, probably be them. But there's not any really right-wing involvement with these groups. There's very minimal right-wing involvement in on this matter in the primaries. Thomas Massey, I always bring this up as Thomas Massey is getting primaried. In part over this issue, also his lack of support for Trump, and he may lose his election, and that would mean that there are pretty much no Republicans who actively care about Israel in Congress. And so it's very minimal outside of the online right where this is getting the message out there. Now, it is getting a message heard among younger conservatives. Younger conservatives have a more negative view of Israel, more skeptical view of Israel. And a lot of conservative commentators are discussing Israel in a way that they would never discuss it 10 years ago. Because I remember when Israel had a flare-up in Gaza in 2014, and all of conservative media was bowing before them and they need to bomb more Palestinians and stuff. And now you see a vigorous debate over this, and you see a lot of conservatives who are criticizing Israel and saying we need to stop funding their wars. And that is a positive development. But in terms of offline and real life and real world stuff, there's been not really any evidence of that. So there's been no involvement in the Palestinian protests. And I think it's just important to say, it's maybe they want to do right-wing protests and all that stuff. But, the Palestinian protests, even if you support their side, we don't have any role with them. So it's not being really deeply invested in them. I think unless you feel you have a role with them, but I don't see that type of role. And if you're wanting to get more conservatives to be critical of Israel and wanting to cut off funding for Israel, the protests are not the way to do that. And even if you want the general public to move in a more critical direction of Israel, the protests are not an effective tool in that. And I think if you are somebody who is, deeply, cares about this war and wants, America to change its relationship with Israel, you can be critical of the protesters, because they're not effective in pushing that goal and advancing that goal. I think some of the other protests, when you've had tens of thousands of people protesting for Palestine in the nation's capital in New York City and these big demonstrations in Michigan, that is sending a message, to Biden. And I think those do have some effect. But the campus protests in itself aren't very effective. It's the same with these environmentalist protesters, or now it's also some of the Palestinian protesters blocking traffic. Everyone hates those people because they're interfering with their lives. And everyone hates, nobody is oh, I'm going to change my opinion about the environment or Israel because these idiots have forced me to sit in traffic for 4 hours. No, they're going to absolutely hate those people because no one wants to sit in traffic for hours on end. So it's not a very effective tactic. And I think you should think about effective tactics and what is the best way to convince the public and advance your goal about this. And you can be critical of those people in that matter. But on the fraternity question and my thoughts, I gave a lot of thoughts. But in conclusion, I'm supportive of them. What they're doing for the vast majority of them has nothing to do with the conflict. It's just about being pro-America, anti-leftist, pro-Trump. And as a right-winger, I think it's hard to be really hostile towards them. And that's my viewpoint on it. I think there'll be a divided opinion among the audience, but that's the opinion I have on it, and I am going to stick to it. So that's that for that topic. We went well over 30 minutes, so I'm going to move on to the campus anti-Semitism bill. We've got 2 questions about that today. It's not a campus anti-Semitism bill, it's just an anti-Semitism bill in general. So the 2 questions are, first, it comes from K-Max. K-Max asks, Mike Lawler, a GOP housemaker, sponsored a bill to punish anti-Semitic speech that passed the House with overwhelming bipartisan support. Is it just me, or whenever Congress does something bipartisan, it is terrible for the American people? GOP decides that instead of letting the left eat each other, it stupidly bails them out and joins in. Bipartisanship, though they limit speech to the Iraq War, try to force amnesty, NAFTA, outsource American jobs, or give aid to Ukraine and Israel. I never see a bipartisan bill that is America first and granting more freedoms and liberties to the American people or security of our border. Do you see this too, Scott? And then the second question comes from Augsburg, and Augsburg asks, after that terrible anti-Semitism bill was passed last week, many on the internet right were chomping at the bit for Matt Walsh, who was outspoken against the bill, to get in trouble with Ben Shapiro on the Daily Wire, the same way Candace Owens did for speaking out against Israel. But much to everyone's surprise, Ben Shapiro also condemned the bill as not helping. Matt Walsh was able to do a victory lap last Friday because he could say to people criticizing him, "Joke's on you," and he's, I guess, my Jewish boss against the bill too. Does this represent a change in conservative media establishment? Are conservatives, Jews like Mark Levin and Ben Shapiro, wising up to the unpopularity of organizations like the ADL and the idea of hate speech, even if it applies to protecting Jews, or Shapiro covering his tracks so as not to see so partisan after the Candace Owens debacle? So there's a lot of things here. I think we should first go after the anti-Semitism bill. It is terrible because it is widening the definition of it. It's widening like biblical. It's including the Bible. It's including general criticism of Israel, and it's expanding the definition of what it is. And the government should not be in the business of defining what anti-Semitism is, what racism is, because once they set a standard, that can be used in law, that can be used in these legal matters. And it was going to be applied to anti-discrimination cases. So, you could be at your office and you could read a Bible passage and somebody says, "Oh, I don't like that. That's offensive. That's anti-Semitic." I don't know why let's just say you're reading a Bible at your office. I don't know if you'd be reading a lot, but let's say you're reading a Bible and somebody could just sue you on, or say that's on anti-discrimination grounds. Say it's anti-Semitic. These are the type of precedents that could be set by the bill. Now, despite how terrible it is, and also the terrible fact that it was bipartisan support, the one thing we do need to keep in mind is that it is not as I don't want to say it's not as horrible because it is bad, but I want to say that the good news is we're still going to have free speech after this. It just creates a precedent that, particularly with some liberal bureaucrats, some creative lawyers could utilize to suppress free speech. But it does not mean that if this bill passes, you're going to be arrested for reading the Bible or criticizing Israel, which is a good thing. I want to say this is a good thing because, that'd be very terrible if it happens. But it is bad in that it's creating this precedent and utilizing what our nation's leaders would be willing to do. You have to say this, is that a lot of our lawmakers would be fully happy with passing what this bill could signify, or what it signifies for a lot of our audiences, that it's a hate speech bill. It's a full-on hate speech bill that they say specifically, like, we are banning anti-Semitic speech in this country. If you say this in your private capacity or on Twitter or in any public forum, you would be arrested for saying this stuff. That would be, a lot of those people would vote for that. The fortunate thing is that the bill doesn't go that far yet. Well, even if the bill went that far, it'd be thrown out in court. It's against the First Amendment. It's against the Constitution. So that's not to say that this is good. I'm just saying that it's not apocalyptic if it did pass. But it is something that we would have to throw out and get changed because it sends symbolically it's terrible. So I just want to make that clear. Now, the expanded definition of it and what it's saying, it pertains to Title VI, and Title VI is very important to universities because it's saying that you can't discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, etc. If you're receiving federal funding, to receive federal funding. And what somebody could do is it's saying, "Oh, these universities are allowing anti-Semitism. Look at what they're allowing students to criticize Israel. You're going to be stripped of federal funding." And this could create the room for that to happen. And obviously, we should oppose that. Why even? I don't even think I need to explain why. It'd be horrible for the First Amendment, for our constitutional rights, to protest, and we should be allowed to criticize foreign countries and to take a different stance from what our foreign policy blob has on a foreign policy matter and not be stripped of our funding. And I don't think it's good for universities to impose a standard on universities to say, oh, you've got to totally crack down on these protesters if you want to keep your federal financing. That is a tyrannical move that we should obviously oppose. So that's something I want to get out about the bill. It's terrible. It's bad. And and everyone is right to criticize and oppose it. And even I think that saying that this is an attack on free speech is not wrong, because it can be. It can be. I'm just saying that when and hopefully it doesn't pass. But if it did pass, it does not mean we're all going to be rounded up and arrested for this stuff. Thankfully, it just means that it potentially gives the government the power to crack down on these institutions receiving federal financing, such as universities, and that is terrible. So, all around bad. There's no reason to defend this bill. No one should defend this bill, and I think that's why Ben Shapiro and others are coming to its attack. So, first question, I'll go on the bipartisan nature of it, on how it's bad. Yes, is that generally this shows that when Congress is able to reach a consensus on matters, it's terrible. And that's why polarization is awesome, or is good, because it's better for Congress not to pass things and cannot get along. If they did get along, we would get amnesty. We would have gotten that terrible Senate deal that they made earlier this year that would have allowed for a backdoor amnesty, that would have granted legalization to millions of these so-called asylum seekers. It would allow for criminal justice reform, which is terrible. It allows for everything that they can agree bipartisan is horrible. Whether it's a new war or new rewards for the black community or whatever, it's all bad. You shouldn't support it. That's why we want more polarization, because if you have polarization, you don't get stuff that is terrible. And during the Cold War, when we had a high degree of bipartisanship, that's when tons of terrible things were passed. Civil Rights Acts, not just in 64 or 65, but elsewhere, but past that. Immigration Act of 65 and the Immigration Act of 1990 and the Amnesty of 86. You've got all these terrible things and sanctions on South Africa. There's all of these terrible measures that a lot of the stuff can't get passed now. But even if the stuff that can get passed, it's like trillions for Israel, almost trillions, billions for Ukraine. And so you want more polarization so they don't pass these things. And we're all dependent on Republicans to be so opposed to measures and it could just be for the stupid reason or the shallow reason of, well, the Democrats are for it, so I'm against it. That's still better than anything else, and we want them to develop in that direction. So bipartisanship is always about fucking over America. That's how it always ends up. And it is terrible. It is something. It's a question I need to return back to and more. I'm sure there's going to be another terrible example of bipartisanship later this year, so I will delve a little bit more deeply into it, into why Republicans do this. I mean, this one is very clear. I mean, they have all their donors telling them, like, we need a firm stance against anti-Semitism. This is the number one issue. And so all these Republicans pass the bill. Now, the fact that a large number of Republicans voted against this, or at least a number of them did, it's something. It is a step in direction. We just need more of them. We need the majority of them, not just a handful, or not just like a third of them to vote. So I think it was less than a third. I think it was like more like a fourth. But in any case, yes, bipartisanship is usually bad. Now to go to Augsburg's case about Shapiro. Shapiro is, he is dependent on an online right audience, and he has to cater to them more than he would like. And on the online right, as I've said, there is much more critical attitude of Israel compared with the offline right. I think the offline right isn't maybe that, deeply invested in the issue, but if you turn on Fox News, oh my God, it is a completely different world from what right-wing Twitter is. I mean, that is like, we stand with Israel. It's like, we love Israel. Israel is awesome. Their war is awesome. Everything they're doing is great over there. We fully support the war. There's like no criticism of the war, no criticism of Israel. A completely different right-wing Twitter, where I would say even the majority of opinions you see are critical of Israel. And I think that reaches Shapiro's audience. And I think Shapiro also knows that everyone besides himself who's on his roster would be critical of this idea because they know that, they've built up this reputation to be pro free speech for many years and anti censorship, and then they try to pass a hate speech bill. It's bad optics for Shapiro to be supportive of this. And so Shapiro he is a clever political operator. He knows what positions to take to keep his audience and build up his audience, and he's not going to go full overboard into this stuff. I would imagine Mark Levin is supportive of this bill. Mark Levin is like Fox News. I mean, he's like far off beyond Ben Shapiro because he doesn't depend on an online right audience. He just depends on Fox News boomers and his talk radio audience. Completely different audience. And so he can go full on losing his mind. Not like Ben Shapiro hasn't lost his mind too, but Shapiro has to show a greater degree of awareness than Levin does because of their audiences. And they do know that everyone hates the conservatives hate the ADL. I think Shapiro's honest opinion about this, I think it's more I would say it's more of a cynical ploy on his point, on his perspective, just to shore up his audience and to know what they're like. And I think there's been a hit to them from Candace Owens' debacle, and he doesn't want to show. I think it does get under his skin that everyone says that he's like an Israel firster, and in a lot of ways he is. I mean, it's a fair assessment, but he has to pretend he's not, and he has to pretend to his audience. And I think a lot of his audience, if he went full on in Mark Levin mode, that they would turn against him. So he has to show some awareness of where they're at. He's almost there, but he opposes this bill in that measure. And there's been people who have been defending this bill like, oh, you're an anti-Semite. Oh, you really? Actually, it is something, a positive element that in conservative commentary, it's been overwhelmingly negative outside of like talk radio and Fox News. And arguments in the past, if there was opposition to the bill, everyone would be like, you're an anti-Semite, you're a Nazi. But now pretty much everyone understands that this is a threat to free speech and it should be opposed on those grounds. Now, when it comes to ADL, I think they do generally are not fans of the ADL it's obviously not for their stance on Israel. I think they still like the ADL when they go after anti-Israel critics and others, but they do realize the ADL is like a fully part of the left. I mean, it always was, but it's more obvious now, and that they're targeting more conservatives and others, and they realize that the ADL has a slightly different agenda on important matters, on some matters that they care to them or to their audience, and they do not like the direction that the ADL has taken under Jonathan Greenblatt. The ADL before Jonathan Greenblatt took over was still terrible, but it was less involved in stuff like supporting LGBT, supporting Black Lives Matter and this type of thing. It was less fully invested in every left-wing fad at that time. It's still very left-wing, still would criticize people for, even if they were just general racism, even if it didn't have anything involved with anti-Semitism, still trying to censor people, still hysteric. It was just, it had more the appearance of, once again, being nonpartisan or bipartisan, which that's not always a good thing, as I just said in the last segment. But it's like fully liberal. It's fully on the left. And the left hates them too, because they know that their foreign policy takes and their Israel takes, and the far left is now anti-Israel, and they don't like their pro-censorship either. But the conservatives, I think they generally don't like the ADL now, because in the past they perceived them as more nonpartisan. Not really true, but they perceive that, and now you can't even pretend they're nonpartisan. It's full-on element of the left. So rather than just being a general nonpartisan Jewish organization. So I think that's like the part of the genuine turn against them with that. So those are my thoughts on the bill. It is terrible. Hopefully the Senate kills it. I don't know what the Senate is planning to do. I mean, it was an overwhelming majority. It was like well over 300 votes in favor of this, or over 300 votes in favor of the bill. So hopefully it dies in the Senate. You don't want that expansion. I mean, anytime the government should be defining these terms. Anti-discrimination law needs to be completely thrown out, and the government should be in the business of regulating these matters no matter what. And it is terrible for free speech for our leaders to eagerly embrace this idea just because their donors are telling them to do this. And the overwhelming number of congressmen that voted for this is depressing. So that's my viewpoint on the bill. So we're now moving on. KMax has another question, but somebody else has a question I want to get to first. This comes from Liberal Farts College Apparatchik. I know a lot of people are wanting to get want me to talk about this, and so it's about Nicholas J. Fuentes returning to Twitter and my thoughts on what his impact will be. Yes, this is long coming. It's been surprising that he hasn't been reinstated earlier. I mean, everyone else has. I mean, Andrew Tate, Alex Jones. Only notable person I could think of. There's a few other people, but probably the biggest example is Jared Taylor's not been reinstated. But the other example would have been Fuentes. And Elon has let him back. And even without being on Twitter, he has a major impact on Twitter. I mean, even with his alt accounts he had, he would always get a high engagement and be driving the discourse. And now that he has his account back, he is, really dominating the discourse on the internet, right? His tweets have gotten like over 20,000 likes. He had a space last night where he had I think 27,000 people are listening in. So he's making a huge impact already. And I think his unique talent for social media especially, and just his communication, skills, because I think one thing that's made him big both on Twitter and TikTok is that he has these videos. And in terms of communication skills are your oratory. There's very few people who can match him. He's an extremely gifted communicator. And all these people always say is he turned to the far right because he couldn't succeed elsewhere. I mean, the fact is, if he had been a standard, normal conservative or whatever, he would have his own Fox show now. He wouldn't be as interesting. He wouldn't be, I think, as a diehard of an audience or fanatical of an audience, but he would have been successful no matter what because of the unique talent he has. And the reason why people pay attention to him so much is because of that talent he has in speaking. I don't want to show. And the fact that he can, go on 5 nights a week with very little notes and speak for 3 hours at length is an impressive feature. And I even remember, when one of these protests after the 2020 election, I think this was in Pennsylvania, I saw he gave a 40-minute speech that everyone was, going crazy for. No notes, no real preparation, totally off the cuff. And then he followed it up with another 40-minute speech that everyone thought was amazing and off the cuff. So he has that unique talent. And I think a lot of people, he is a divisive figure, but a lot of people don't want to acknowledge that talent. And so if he is back on Twitter, he is going to be making a huge impact on the discourse. I do think that Biden and some other people are going to try to make him more of a campaign issue just because of some of the controversial things he said, I guess, and they're going to want to tie it to Trump. I don't think it'll be that effective because there are so many problems in this country, and, Biden or whatever saying oh, look, there's these racist and evil people supporting Trump. People are just going to ignore him. They ignored him in 2016 in the same way that Hillary Clinton made her alt-right speech in the way to attack Trump. It didn't work. And it won't work this time either. But that's going to be a testament to, I think, his deep impact if he becomes, it's an issue that the Biden campaign wants to make out of and that they're paying attention to it that much. So, yeah, I think with Twitter, he is going to have definitely a major impact. He was already having an impact before when he was not even allowed under his own name. And now when he's allowed under his own name, he is certainly going to be shaping the discourse on there. And I think it'll probably bleed out into the real world or into offline politics with what they want to campaign on. And I guess that is a testament to the talent he has and his ability to communicate to a lot of people. So he always makes it. He always makes news, and that's something that a lot of people don't have the ability to. The ability to make. I mean, it's like something that's similar to Trump. You know, Trump was able to be in the news for like 4 decades. prior to, you know, he'd always been a celebrity. He'd never been out of the news. You know, and it has been, and yet he always made himself well known. And there's a unique talent to that. So I guess that will definitely be Nick on Twitter. We'll see how long. You know, I don't think Elon will ban him again. Elon's kind of made his peace with just allowing it as a more free speech, absolute free speech zone. I mean, getting banned from Twitter now is an accomplishment. You really have to do something. The only way I know that people get banned is for making direct violent threats of like, that's like the only way you can get banned. But anyway, people easily return and can appeal their suspensions. It's completely different from the old Twitter. So I don't think he'll get banned unless there's some major change at Twitter, which I don't think there will be. So we'll be seeing a lot of Fuentes content for the rest of the year on Twitter, or X as it's now known. Now for the final question comes from K-Max. K-Mass asks, it's a university question. What I hear from my normal and fair leftist friend is not that liberals dominate the elite colleges like Harvard or Yale because they are smarter than conservatives, but because of forward thinking. Conservatives embrace tradition and liberals want change. At this point, is that still true? Since the woke control everything, what left is there to change, or what is that why they cannibalize each other? Your view, why all the elite colleges have such far left student bodies and faculty and have now for over 70 years, where do all the smart conservatives go? I don't think that's true. I don't think it's because of tradition and stuff. I just think if you're most intellectually curious people are intellectual people from professors. This is explaining academia are going to be more left wing because in America, if you're like a standard conservative, you're wanting to go with the flow and be kind of a normal person. You're probably not going to be. Academia is not as appealing to you. It's more about like starting a business and that type of stuff that attracts people. So most of our high IQ or ambitious people go into business and finance and that type of stuff rather than going into academia or going into politics. And so professors have generally in America have always been left leaning. It's not even just 70 years, it's always been there. I mean, right and left were not well defined prior to the New Deal and to the 1950s, but a lot of them were very progressive. And that's just what it is in America. I think for most people, they view liberalism or leftism as just a default ideology if you're an intellectually curious person, an intellectual. That's just what it is. I mean, we should change that, but that's why. For the students, I think a lot of young students, they first get into this stuff and they have a strong moral belief and they view that liberalism is morally good. And if you want to be politically active and make a difference in the world, leftism is what you need to do, while conservatism is stale and boring and bad and bigoted, and so you don't want to be a part of that. And it's more about social status. I think if you want elite social status in our society, you become a good liberal. You don't become a conservative. I mean, that can impact your elite social status. It's like, oh, you vote for Trump? That's low status. That's bad. That's going to set you as a bad person. You don't want to be like that. And those people at elite universities are very status conscious. And they don't want to be perceived as a bad person or a low status, so they adopt liberalism or leftism to accommodate that dynamic. And I think that's more it than being forward thinking. That the forward thinking that's just silly. Where do all the smart conservatives go? I think they go there, but they just keep quiet and they don't move along. A lot of the smart conservatives at the very elite universities are are pussies because they share the same habits as their peers. I mean, they may be very conservative, but they're very status conscious. So they'll be like, I'm a conservative, but I don't like Trump, and I'm a conservative, but I don't like, I feel that they've gone too racist and all these things. So that's the case for a lot of these students or these elite students at these places because their primary goal is not their principles, it's to get ahead in life. And to get ahead in life, they've got to accommodate the reigning ideology, which is liberalism. And so a lot of these strivers and other ambitious types just accept that as the norm. Now, something may go wrong in their lives or something in the world that they experience, like it's a robbery or something, they get denied a job or something that changes their perspective, and then they become much more right wing. Or they're a dreamer type or an idealist type, and leftism doesn't appeal to them, and they get into the more esoteric elements of the right wing in America. There's a lot of that. I mean, there are a number of smart conservatives at some of these schools, but they keep their head down. Some ways for smart reasons, some ways is just it's a part of their character that they are in. I think if they're a bomb thrower, that type of person, they're going to a different university than Harvard or Yale, and so yeah, that's I think that's why universities are overwhelmingly left wing and liberal. All my viewpoints on that. So that is it for today's Highly Respected. I'm sure it's going to cause a lot of debate. So I look forward to seeing all the comments on it. And we're going to have a lot of great content later this week. We've got, of course, an article tomorrow, mailbag Wednesday, article Thursday, and a fantastic IQ supplement on Friday. So lots of content for you to look out for. So until next time, stay respected.